One of my favorite anecdotes from Plutarch's life is in the lead up to the first battle at Heraclea in 280, down right on the instep of the boot of Italy. And Pyrrhus is reconnoitering, and he goes up with a friend of his, and he checks out the Romans' camp and the way that they're organized and everything. And he takes this in and he ponders it, and he turns to his friend and he says that the taxis, the word we get tactics from, the organization, the discipline of these barbarians doesn't look very barbarian to me. It's very hard to know what Pyrrhus really had in mind when he went across to Italy. He probably didn't really know what he was up against when he went.
There is something romantic about the commander who is incredibly gifted but loses. That is a good story because it has that element of tragedy in it. In antiquity, he was one of the most famous, most admired commanders. He has this status because he's the first big league opponent the Romans face. And they managed to win. And they managed to win, it's the best possible movie result. They win in the last reel.
You have huge stakes when the Roman and Greek worlds collide for the first time. The old power of the East against the new power of the West. You have big personalities, massive battles, war elephants. It's box office drama. And yet somehow it's a story very few people know.
When Pyrrhus is born in the latter part of the 4th century BC, this is a world that's gone through incredible upheaval, and it's still going on.
Pyrrhus is a very, very kind of tangential relative of Alexander the Great, not particularly direct. But when he's born, Alexander is dead. Alexander's empire is disintegrating into violent and chaotic, and again, very confusing civil war between Alexander's senior generals. There's such an enormous amount of crossing and double crossing. It makes the fantasy Game of Thrones really look like kind of the cakewalk at the county fair.
That intrigue of intermarriages and backstabbings and alliances shifting and fracturing, it's real. And it was real on the stage of the Successor Wars.
The period after Alexander the Great was not an easy period for anyone who was running one of the Greek kingdoms.
Without Pyrrhus, we probably wouldn't talk too much about Epirus at all. He's the man who, for a brief period, forces it onto the world stage, becomes a player in the Wars of the Successors, becomes a serious opponent of Rome, of Carthage. Epirus is on the fringes, but it must have seemed to someone like Pyrrhus that, who knows, other people have done this, other people have made empires. Why can't I?
Yeah, the kingdom of Epirus that Pyrrhus inherited, ultimately, after a lot of problems and difficulties, is on the fringe of the Greek world. But the same is true of Macedonia. Alexander and his father Philip were regarded as not proper Greeks. One of the ways in which you can assert your claims to be a real Greek is precisely to set up claims of descent and lineage. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important to Pyrrhus, not only because of the Alexander imitation, which is clearly very important, but it's also his way of saying, no matter what you say about us Epirotes, I am a real Greek, because I'm descended from Achilles, and no one is more Greek than Achilles.
It's quite difficult for us to understand the importance of the Homeric epics in Greek society, because there isn't really anything quite like it in the modern world. For someone like Pyrrhus, where this is his claim to fame, his claim to importance is his royal blood. And that royal family claims this immense antiquity and descent from Achilles. You're from that line. You are from the greatest warrior of all time. And that's the expectation that people are raising you to say, this is what you've got to be. You've got to be the bravest. You've got to be the best. In some ways, Pyrrhus almost represents an ideal for this Hellenistic age of the successors. He is personally very brave, and he comes closer than anybody else to living up to the Alexandrian example in his style of leadership. The fact that he fights all these single combats and keeps winning, that he takes these wounds.
Much has been made about Pyrrhus of Epirus' reputation in single combat as a warrior who fights out front. And this is actually in a Greek tradition. There's a wonderful word in Greek, I love this word so much, promachos. Pro, first or out in front, machoi, the fighter, right? And so what is a promachos? The one who goes first, the one who fights up front. God, I love this term. So this notion that a Greek warrior goes first is critical, right? It's critical to establishing the legitimacy and the reputation of a king. And so we see this again and again in Pyrrhus' story. We have two single combats that Pyrrhus engages in famously in the story. And I chose the second one, the Mamertine, because it's way more badass than the first one. So the first one is Pyrrhus fighting Pentaucus, who is a general of Demetrius. And, you know, they break spears, you know, they spear each other's horses. And then Pyrrhus gets wounded, and he wounds Pentaucus worse. And Pentaucus is carried away, bleeding out. But the second story, which is a lot less realistic, is way cooler, which is that he's harassed by Mamertines leaving Sicily. He's sick of it, pushes through his own bodyguard, and cuts this guy in half so that his body falls to either side. This is a great story. But is this true, right? Is this a trope or a myth? The answer is we don't know, and we can't know. And historians hate that. We hate having to say, I don't know.
Yeah, the stories of Pyrrhus in single combat are, I think, really plausible. And I think there's every chance that these stories are accurate. I mean, he died, after all, in a messy brawl in the middle of the city of Argos, but there he was, you know, fighting hand to hand. And he had done that right from the beginning of his career at the Battle of Ipsus. So I think when Pyrrhus is described as acting in this way, we should think of this as being a conscious attempt on his part to emulate Alexander and to look like Achilles. And they took these role model scenarios very seriously indeed.
Pyrrhus comes into this world, but he is famous enough through the Alexandrian connection, and he's a king, or can make himself a king, but it's of Epirus. It isn't Macedonia. It's not quite in the first division. It's not quite the first league. It's close to it. It's got an army that's now Macedonian in style, and that's the way of fighting, because that's the way everybody who is anybody is fighting at this time.
It's impossible to overstate how dominant and how influential the Macedonian pike phalanx was before, during, and after the life of Alexander the Great. It is the war machine that conquered most of the known world. And that's the style of warfare Pyrrhus practices and perfects for nearly a decade in Epirus and in Macedonia. He's a real player there. But on the western side of the Adriatic Sea, there's another player emerging with some innovative new ideas about the future of warfare.
You know, it's always an open question of how much did Pyrrhus personally know about Rome. Herodotus, at the end of the 5th century, never mentions Rome. He knows about some Italian peoples like the Etruscans, doesn't know about Rome. By the 4th century, someone like Aristotle knows about Rome.
We need to be careful not to anticipate Rome's rise to the extent where it becomes dominant throughout the Italian peninsula, because it hasn't done that yet. And the 4th century has been a time of mixed fortunes for the Romans. You know, when you've had the Gallic sack of the city, and you've then gone into sort of overdrive where you build these massive city walls to try and make sure this never happens again.
The legion was a cultural development that came out of Rome. It was an almost traumatic reaction to this experience of loss at the Allia in 390 BC, where the Gallic warband destroyed the Roman phalanx, sacked Rome. I mean, think about that cultural trauma. And they developed this new military formation, borrowing heavily from their enemies in an effort to make sure that never happened to them again. The subject of Legion versus Phalanx was to discuss the interplay and really the transition of power between the Phalanx, which was the dominant heavy infantry formation all the way from the time of ancient Sumer up to the rise of the Roman legion. This classical phalanx evolves, for many reasons, into the pike-armed phalanx, where you go from a 7 to 9 foot spear to a 16 to 21 foot pike held in two hands with the shields hanging here. And instead of facing the enemy this way, you're now bladed entirely to the side and you're packed much tighter together. And this makes you a lot less maneuverable, but it does produce a lot more killing points out in front of you, and it requires an enemy to fight their way through them. You're extremely vulnerable on the flanks because you really can't maneuver at all with 21 feet of pikes. Some people have said this isn't true. I believe it is. You have a forest of pikes overhead that actually provides some shelter from missiles. You have a lot more armor because you can't really move. And into this comes the Legion. And this becomes this much more maneuverable and very Celtic influenced, by the way, unit of 3 lines, this triplex aces, that are formed together in small maniples. So instead of a giant line like the Phalanx, it's broken, and they're positioned in a checkerboard so they can relieve each other. There's double the distance between fighters. The main weapon is a short sword, really almost a long knife. Each fighter equipped with 2 javelins, which you can throw from different distances, which of course sticks in the shield of your opponent, or hopefully sticks in their head, either killing them or wounding them or forcing them to shed pieces of armor or drop their shields because it's got a giant javelin stuck in it now that disrupts the formation. And the rub happens when you, with this, because look, this little long knife, right? If you're going to kill somebody with it, you got to be close enough to hug them. And the guy you're fighting, he's on the other end of a 21-foot pike, right? So you got some steel to get through to get to that dude. So the challenge for the Roman legion is get through that thicket of spear points, pike points, get up close enough to kiss that guy, and that's all she wrote. That's really where this contest comes down. And it's a contest between 2 tactical doctrines. This non-maneuverable wall of spear points, which is supposed to pin the enemy in place so that cavalry elements or elephant elements can deliver the knockout blow. And this Roman doctrine of greater flexibility, closer distance, get up on him and get that knife in his gut, punch him with the shield, get that knife in his gut. And that's really what was at play when the Legion met the Phalanx. And the real question that was decided in here is, which of these heavy infantry formations is going to dominate ancient battlefields? And more importantly, because they were both outgrowths of respective cultures, the Phalanx really was a Hellenic development. So you really are seeing not just 2 formations contesting, but it's a battle for which culture is going to be preeminent.
At this point, Rome is without question the hegemon of central Italy. That said, most of southern Italy is feeling the weight of sort of Roman hegemony, but is not directly administered or controlled by Rome.
Yeah, Magna Graecia is a fascinating area. What Pyrrhus would have expected, what he would have known about these people, very, very, very hard to know, very hard to say. But he would probably have seen the people of Tarentum as being as Greek as he was.
Well, the city of Tarentum in southern Italy has been important, powerful, prosperous for a long time. Now, the Tarentines have in the past been allied to the Romans, and there's been a treaty that the Romans promised they wouldn't sail beyond a certain point on the Italian coast, which the Romans appear deliberately or accidentally to have broken.
The spark of the conflict between Tarentum and Rome is a small Roman fleet, like 10 ships. The Romans don't have a particularly big navy, but there's a small fleet, sails into Tarentum, and the Tarentines may think that they're being attacked. The Romans, it seems, are actually just trying to draw some supplies and, just want to dock. But in this moment of already high tension, there's a real misunderstanding.
It may have been largely accident. It may have come down to both sides' concepts of their honour, of their power, of how they should be treated with respect by others. But the Tarentines are clearly bothered. They also look on the basis that the Romans seem stronger than they are, so let's bring in somebody even stronger from outside, and let's go to someone who fights like Alexander, who's got that sort of army. These are the best in the world. These are the people who've dominated warfare for more than a generation.
It was a very, very significant encounter for the Romans. This was the first time that Roman activities, Roman history, had intersected with Greece proper. And from the point of view of the Greeks as well, this was a very significant moment. From their point of view, also, this was when Rome really becomes part of history. There are ancient chronographers, for example, who give lists of dates, and they don't start giving any Roman dates until Pyrrhus. This is when Rome actually, they don't have a date for the foundation of Rome, they don't have a date for anything before Pyrrhus. So when Pyrrhus comes into Italy, this is when Greece and Rome really intersect properly for the first time, from the Greek point of view and from the Roman point of view.
Whether or not Pyrrhus has hopes of long-term conquest and annexation, I think is an open question, in part because he bounces around so much, it makes us wonder.
When we talk about any figure from the ancient past, we really are looking through a lens darkly. We're having to look into a past, and so much of the source material has been lost. And from this, we're trying to piece together the character of a single individual, all of that human complexity distilled from a couple of lines of ancient text.
I suspect there's probably an element of, well, let's just see what happens. Let's make it up as we go along. You don't get an impression that Pyrrhus is working towards any sort of master plan, but then that's probably true of a lot of the adventurers.
So a lot of people wonder about Pyrrhus's constancy and focus. That's a constant criticism that's levied against him. So why? Why go to Italy? And again, the only correct answer is we don't know.
It's very hard to know what Pyrrhus really had in mind when he went across to Italy. One of the themes of Plutarch's life is that he didn't really plan big. He reacts to events. Maybe I've been too influenced by Plutarch's life, but I get the impression of someone who's good at rolling the dice. Let's see what happens. Let's give it a go.
And it doesn't start well. A violent storm brews up in the Adriatic Sea, scattering his invasion fleet. Eventually, most of the ships, carrying something like 25,000 troops, straggle ashore on the southern boot of Italy. And there's no time to waste. Rome is already marching south with a consular army to meet the invaders. This moment we've all been waiting for, the first true encounter between the legion and the Phalanx, is about to begin.
Reconstructions of Pyrrhus's battles must be taken with a huge pinch of salt, and nearly everything about them is uncertain.
Well, and Heraclea is actually somewhat interesting in that in future battles, Pyrrhus is heavily going to rely on Italian allies as part of his manpower. And so most of the Italians that Pyrrhus is hoping to recruit, they kind of hold aloof initially. So the only real force that Pyrrhus has is he has his own army, about 20,000 pikemen, several thousand heavy cavalry. He also has an unknown number of soldiers in the Tarentine levy, probably several thousand, which he seems to use primarily as a kind of picket screen. And against this, there is one consular army. So this is where the Romans have the issue of there's one consul is fighting the Etruscans. He actually has quite a lot of success. The other consul, Valerius Laevinus, marches against Pyrrhus himself.
So Heraclea really is the first conflict of the Pyrrhic War. And it's Pyrrhus holding ground on a river and putting a small holding force of light infantry, skirmishers, missile-capable troops to hold that bank. The thinking being, look, you want to try to cross a river under fire, be my guess, right? Which I think doctrinally makes a lot of sense from the kinds of wars that Pyrrhus is fighting coming out of the wars of the Diadochi. But he hadn't fought Rome before. But seeing the Romans as barbarians, there was just sort of no conception of these people are going to know how to fight like normal people. Meanwhile, the Romans have developed this incredibly sophisticated tactical doctrine, and it's based on, we just discussed it, it's based on getting right here, right? I got a 2-foot knife I got to work with, right? This is where I got to be. So if I got to cross a river, I'm gonna cross a river, And so I think that the beauty of Heraclea is Pyrrhus's clear expectation of what the Romans would do. And Lavinius, this is the Roman consul in command, complete refusal to match these expectations. So they cross the river. Well, now we got a problem because Lavinius is about 2 seconds away from getting a beachhead, and if Pyrrhus is going to stop him, he's got to keep him in the river. Because if you're trying to slog through a river, it's difficult to find footing, it's difficult to dodge missiles. Once the Romans get up on dry land, we're going to have a bigger problem. And he is able to get his phalanx engaged.
Plutarch emphasizes how close fought it is. He says this famously that the fortune in battle changes 7 times. So the impression is of an attritional, a slogging match.
So interestingly enough, in terms of the legion v phalanx, we're told that this is a pretty even battle. But it's the combination of Pyrrhus's superior cavalry and the fact that the Romans have really never encountered war elephants before is what makes the victory supposedly quite decisive.
Now, one note on the elephants here. When we think about elephants in 2021, we think about the African and these giant elephants. You could put a house on top of these things and they wouldn't notice. These are almost surely Carthaginian or North African forest elephants, which are now extinct. So we're talking 8 feet high at the shoulder. It's basically like twice the size of a horse. Big, it's scary. You don't want to have one run you over. But this is not an elephant you would see at a zoo today. It usually probably has one person on it, and that person is throwing javelins, and really the point of the elephant is scaring the enemy and also breaking up formations by riding on through them. So these are the elephants that likely are brought in. It's the Rome's first encounter with them. They're probably terrified. And the phalanx does what the phalanx is supposed to do. It pins the Roman legion in place. It pins it in place at the river line or in the river, and it pins them there long enough that these elephants are able to deliver a knockout blow on the flanks, which is very similar to how Alexander fought. So the battle is won.
Pyrrhus follows up by marching supposedly to within about 50 kilometers of Rome. And this is also the point where the Romans seriously consider negotiating a peace.
The Senate receives Pyrrhus's ambassador, they listen to his pleas, and they are supposed to be wavering and thinking about negotiating when Appius Claudius Secus, Appius Claudius the Blind, is helped into the Senate house, this old man who hasn't been active in politics because of failing health, poor eyesight, and basically tells them, no, you can't possibly negotiate with anybody while they're on Italian soil. And people have said, well, it's significant if the Romans, even at this stage, are saying, we won't talk to you while you're in Italy, not just we won't talk to you while you're on our land. The terms are not particularly harsh. He's offering peace to the Romans, but the Romans have to accept that Tarentum is strong. They have to show respect to the Tarentines. Now, to us, these seem like very minor things. To an ancient state, the terms you accept for a treaty show the degree of victory or defeat in the war. If you start admitting that you're vulnerable, it's an invitation to other enemies to think, okay, Romans beat us last time, but let's have another go. So, from their point of view, they don't feel they've lost badly enough to be compelled to do this. From Pyrrhus's point of view, this could have solved the war. He could have got a victory, great for his glory, great for his reputation. Maybe the reward for that will be money, subsidy from the Tarentines, maybe recruit some troops as well, and you move on to another. If you can have, it would have almost been the perfect campaign.
There's a wonderful other story which I do think is true, which is Cineas, who is Pyrrhus's advisor and friend, comes to him and says, when we deal with Rome, we're dealing with a Lernaean hydra. And what Cineas is referring to is Rome's ability to recruit. In military history, we focus on tactics, right? And tactics, they don't really win wars. This kind of stuff wins wars. And I think Pyrrhus had the glimmerings of an understanding, but it's at Asculum that he has the real understanding. This is in the following year.
Plutarch talks about a 2-day battle, the first day fought in broken terrain that favours the Romans more than it does Pyrrhus, because he can't make most use of his elephants, perhaps the phalanx, followed by a second day in which the ground is more in his favour and the Romans are beaten. So people try and reconcile this into a single day, combining elements of both. But again, it is really difficult. Trying to establish any clear narrative of what happened is probably doomed.
Nonetheless, Asculum seems to have been a complicated battle. It seems that the Romans are really worried about Pyrrhus's elephants, and so they invent all kinds of contraptions to fight the elephants, including spiked flaming wagons that can be pushed against the elephant. I mean, they don't work, suffice it to say. But it does show the Romans still pretty spooked about this new kind of almost technology, and they're not quite sure how to beat it yet. Probably here is where Pyrrhus, if we follow Polybius, is starting to incorporate Italian maniples into his own army, so he may also have a much more kind of flexible line that combines the sort of wallop of a pike phalanx with the flexibility of men with large shields and javelins. At any rate, at this point now, both consular armies are beaten. On one hand, this is a pretty nice victory. The Romans are really roughly handled, but this is also where we get the Pyrrhic victory.
He wins at Asculum, and when he's touring the victorious field that he now holds, he's congratulated on it, and he has this amazing quote: "One more such victory, and we are undone." Which I get chills every time I hear it, because the losses are so great. But I think what's also inherent in that quote is that point I made at Heraclea, is Pyrrhus going, oh my God, what did I just bite off? And then comes Sicily. He leaves in the middle of the campaign. Did he leave because he was scared? I don't know.
From Pyrrhus's point of view, he's fought 2 battles against the Romans and won, but he's suffered losses and the war hasn't got anywhere. The Romans won't give in. So on the one hand, it sort of shows a Pyrrhus who is unreliable, rather fickle, but he might tell the story from the other point of view that he hasn't had the backing from the Tarentines that would allow him. They want him to fight this war, but they won't give him the resources to win it.
And so, in 278 BC, Pyrrhus leaves behind his allies in southern Italy for a distraction in Sicily. This is classic Pyrrhus, a new adventure against a new boogeyman. And this time, it's the Greek colonies of Sicily who need his help against Carthage. And in fairly short order, Pyrrhus is kicking ass. He systematically conquers every Carthaginian stronghold except one. This is also classic Pyrrhus. He almost gets the job done. Almost. And he won't be able to stick around long enough to see this one to the end, because back in Italy, the Roman war machine has rebuilt her legions for a final showdown.
Oddly, we don't have a great sense of what's going on in terms of Roman internal politics. We do hear of the Romans sort of tepidly campaigning against, I think, some southern Italian allies, but not trying to necessarily drive straight to Tarentum. It's not impossible that the Romans, are also kind of biding their time. Is Pyrrhus going to come back? Is he going to get killed in Sicily? Pyrrhus is gone in 278. Certainly by 275, some of the Italians are calling, because the Romans are starting to more aggressively campaign in the southern Apennines. So, in some ways, Pyrrhus's recall, it's a bit of push-pull. The Sicilians are saying, gosh, we wish he would just go. But he's starting to get, again, kind of SOS signs to say, hey, the Romans are, being much more aggressive. If we want to assign a kind of prudent image of Pyrrhus, is one of his sort of the key aspect of his strategy in the Battle of Beneventum was not to fight both consular armies at once. Because the Romans, when Pyrrhus comes back, the Romans again say this is bad. We're sending both consuls, and Pyrrhus, who's I want to emphasize again, bad at strategy, is pretty good at kind of operations and tactics. So he manages, as the two armies are maneuvering, to kind of through a feint draw off one of the consular armies, and so the one that he attacks at Beneventum it's just one, and it seems that he feels that he has enough troops to fight one consular army, but can't fight two.
And at Beneventum, Pyrrhus tries to do a night march, a flanking maneuver around to get above the Roman castrum, the Roman camp. We don't know why this night march through the woods goes totally wrong. Some have theorized that there's a lot of bad blood against Pyrrhus now for his abandonment of Italy on the Sicilian adventure, and huge losses that his Samnite allies took as a result of that. and that maybe local guides might have misled him, but that could also be trying to make excuses. Look, night marches are hard. I've done them. I've done them with modern equipment. It's hard. In the ancient world, it's almost impossible. It gets bungled, and he winds up in the correct position, but it's dawn, and the Romans see him coming, and they have plenty of time to get ready, and they ain't scared of elephants anymore. They know exactly what to do, and they eat his lunch. They eat his lunch in two directions, and it's the end. It's the end of his adventurism in Italy. A lot of people think that it's the end of him, and it isn't.
Yeah, at this point, Pyrrhus is moving on to greener pastures. One thing that may make those pastures somewhat greener is there's now this kind of huge power vacuum in Macedonia again. And so it's possible that Pyrrhus, realizing that maybe Italy is kind of a dead end, realizing he doesn't have enough troops to really fight the Romans, maybe surprised that, within a couple years of the thumping he's given him, they are again raising 30 to 40,000 men and 2 consular armies to come after him. I think some of it he may say, well, look, the greener pasture is now Greece and Macedonia.
Pyrrhus goes back to Greece. He sort of seems to toy with the idea of Macedonia, but then again, there's this sort of sense of, well, actually, is that going to work? And, oh, hey, somebody's invited me to go down to the Peloponnese, so let's go down there and intervene. And but there again, he diverts to attack Argos. Plutarch tells the story that this old woman sees Pyrrhus fighting her son and throws a tile at him and kills him, or mortally injures him. There's nothing really he could do to dodge that. But it is striking. Pyrrhus is killed fighting hand to hand again, leading from the front. And yes, he's killed by an old woman throwing a tile, but he's doing what Achilles should do.
People sort of wonder, why isn't Pyrrhus more famous today? Well, he's an incredibly significant commander, really, and an extraordinary human being, and has this incredibly, I certainly wouldn't say admirable, but storybook life, if you believe even half of what the sources say of him.
Yeah, Pyrrhus is under a cloud because, after all, he failed. His reputation among modern historians is, a brilliant but ultimately futile career.
In some ways, it doesn't help that he's just kind of this dead end. I think Pyrrhus is just good, almost is best as a cautionary tale. Here's a guy who's a brilliant fighter, and yet because of a total lack of strategic vision, basically fails everywhere. Never holds on to Macedonia. The Romans take southern Italy. The Carthaginians quickly reestablish themselves in Sicily, and Pyrrhus himself is then gets a tile dropped on his head. That's the end.
So a lot of people describe Pyrrhus as a failure. But the thing I'm not comfortable with is the judgment call, right? That somehow a good king and a proper king would empire build, would stay where he was and expand boundaries and form a dynasty. Like there's some kind of ethical impetus to that decision. Pyrrhus of Epirus was living his best life, right? Like, this guy wanted to see the world and kick everybody's ass in it.
I suppose in the sense that Pyrrhus doesn't turn Epirus into a great empire. He doesn't become king of Macedonia. He doesn't become one of the real key players in the struggle for success, for the succession to Alexander the Great. Then he's a failure. But I think it's a little harsh, though, to judge anyone on a sense of, success or failure, because most historical figures don't achieve everything they might wanted to have done. And others, of course, don't try.
No one judges Pyrrhus on his own terms. What if Pyrrhus was a guy who did exactly what he wanted when he wanted? What if Pyrrhus was a guy who was able to reinvent himself in catastrophe after catastrophe his entire life, from his youth, gaining and losing a kingdom, to being reinstalled on his throne and having to flee again, and then being reinstalled again, and then he comes over. And I think it is just as fair to say that Pyrrhus was a man who lived his life on his own terms and kicked ass at it, as it is to say he was a failure because he didn't build an empire that, looking back from a lens in 2021, we have decided arbitrarily is the value. It certainly was a cultural value of the time, but individuals, even in the ancient world, had the ability to assert themselves. And we have just as much evidence to see that Pyrrhus was just such an individual.
People in the ancient world respected Pyrrhus. They thought that he was a great commander, he was a great king, even if he lost. He is very much a sign of that era, and sums up the chaos, the uncertainty, the fact that nobody knew what the future held then, and anything seemed possible in the generation after Alexander. It's almost the Achilles model again. He's famous even though he dies.
The appeal of Achilles is primarily his invincibility and his extraordinary prowess, but it's inextricable from the fact that the Iliad is all about his ultimate vulnerability and the fact that he makes a conscious decision. He can stay at Troy and die young and have glory that will live forever, or he can go home and live to an old age and no one will ever hear of him. And he makes the conscious decision after the death of his friend Patroclus that he's going to go for option one. He's going to stay at Troy, avenge Patroclus' death, and will be famous forever.